Welcome to this poetry lesson on piano by D.H. Lawrence. Really like this little poem. It's very soft and mellow, and it captures a feeling of modernism, which is one of my favorite kind of literary movements or time periods in literature. It's very modernist, as we'll look at in a minute. So I'm going to go through, firstly, the vocab in this poem so that you can fully understand it. Then I'll read the poem and then I'll go through some important ideas to do with form, structure, language, context, themes, etc. So, as with all scribbly lessons, just jot down stuff that you don't know already, anything that's useful or new or important, especially stuff that you can use in essays for your particular exam board and level. So, yeah, when you're ready, we'll start with the vocab list. So, we've got a few words here. Appassionato. Appassionato. I speak a bit of Italian, so that's kind of how I guess you'd say if you're Italian. I would just say appassionato if I was saying it in an English way. Either way, difficult word to spell, but probably quite a significant word. Definitely one that you can pick up on. It's the kind of word that only musicians and people who play music are really familiar with, or people who are Italian, maybe. So it means impassioned or really passionately, and it's a way that you can play a type of music. So if you actually are musical and you play music, you'll know what I mean. But for people who aren't so knowledgeable about music, when you play it on the actual page written alongside the music that you're reading, it will kind of tell you how to play, like what kind of feeling to put into the music. So in this case, it's appassionato, which is like passionately with kind of energy and vigor. Poignant is a lovely word, and I use it a lot in analysis. I learned it at GCSE and I was obsessed with it from then onwards. It's a bit difficult to spell, but totally worth learning. It's kind of beautiful in a sad and moving and touching way. So, kind of beautiful and sad at the same time. Insidious is sort of the opposite. It's like a kind of painful or difficult or harmful in a very secretive or slow way, like something slowly harms you. Like maybe if you eat McDonald's every day, the effect might be insidious because you'll feel fine after a week, but after like 4 weeks, you might start feeling a bit ill, and after 10 weeks, you might be dead. I don't know. There's that documentary, isn't there, where someone eats too much McDonald's? Not that I dislike McDonald's, I really like it in moderation, but you can see how that would be an insidious effect. Over time, it would affect you badly, even if you don't notice it at first. So, hymn is a religious song, usually Christian. So, if you come from a Christian background, you might be confident with that word hymn. It's difficult because it's just spelt really weirdly, Hymn, but pronounced hymn. But yeah, it's kind of religious, it's very musical, and so on. Melancholy is quite similar to poignant, they kind of go together, but melancholy is like a feeling that you have, whereas a poignant is a feeling that something gives off. So a person can be melancholy, and that means that they have this kind of, they feel a bit sad, but in an almost nice way, like they sort of enjoy the level of sadness that they're at. So it's not total depression, it's like a kind of light level of sadness that you sort of enjoy wallowing in. Like I don't know, if you're a bit down and you're like, oh, today I'm going to do nothing and just eat McDonald's, eat pizza and watch TV and have a bath and go to bed. You might be melancholy, but you might kind of actually enjoy that type of thing, if you know what I mean. Remembrance is the the state of remembering something. So if you're in a state of remembrance, you're kind of like sort of still and you're thinking back to something and you're remembering. It's a noun, remembrance. So you want to use it like a noun. So now we've got all of those words sorted. Hopefully, you should understand what they mean in the context of the poem. I'm going to read the poem aloud. I always do this with poetry because poetry should always be read aloud. Make sure to read all of your poems aloud multiple times, no matter what level you're at. And they get stuck in your head a lot more easily that way as well, beyond anything else. But you start to notice things about the sound that you hadn't really noticed when you read it on a page. So, yeah, make sure to read your poetry aloud, and I'll read it aloud for you now. Just getting my reading voice on. Softly, in the dusk, a woman is singing to me, taking me back down the vista of years, till I see a child sitting under the piano in the boom of the tingling strings, and pressing the small poised feet of a mother who smiles as she sings. In spite of myself, the insidious mastery of song betrays me back, till the heart of me weeps to belong to the old Sunday evenings at home, with winter outside and hymns in the cozy parlour, the tinkling piano our guide. So now it is vain for the singer to burst into clamour with the great black piano appassionato. The glamour of childish days is upon me. My manhood is cast down in the flood of remembrance. I weep like a child for the past. Sorry, I didn't speak for very long there, but I was just kind of thinking about it and the images of it. So it's not like one of those poems you just read and you get it straight away. And to be honest, no good poem is like that. So don't be put off by poetry if you don't understand it straight away. No one does. If they tell you they do, either it's a bad poem or they don't get it. There's like a real movement of insta poets at the moment that I hate because the poetry you just like understand it straight away and then you move on and you don't think about it anymore and you're like, okay, yeah, that's fine. It doesn't stay with you and you don't have to invest time into it. I like poetry that you have to invest time in. So we're going to invest time into this poem now so that we can understand the poem on a deeper level. So, with that in mind, the first thing to do is go through the story and the summary. So in stanza one, the stanza by stanza summary here, the woman is singing. There's a random woman singing to a speaker. At the time, I thought that he was playing the piano, but I think he's watching her and a piano on stage. So I'm going to change that. This is notes from when I taught these lessons with my students. So it feels like he's in the audience and there's a stage with a singer and a woman. Maybe he's in a bar or something like that. The setting is dusk, so a time between day and night. The music and singing take him back in memory, so they kind of trigger a memory. And he goes back to a point where he sees a child sitting under the piano, pressing the feet of his mother, who is singing and smiling while she plays. We assume that he's the child and that this is a childhood memory. He doesn't say directly, but the way that it's structured, it feels like it's just kind of transported him into his own head a little bit. So this music makes him feel nostalgic, which is a really important word and definitely a crucial word if you're writing essays on this poem. Nostalgia is a feeling when you want to get back to a previous time and you kind of miss the good old days of some far off moment that you used to be part of. So he wants to go back to the time when he spent Sunday evenings in winter with his family, especially his mother. Very important that he kind of connects this singer to his mother and he compares them, and the singer's no way near as good as his mum was. Kind of interesting that aspect of it. So he used to in winter sit around with his family and they'd all sing hymns and they'd be in the parlor room, which is like a kind of similar to a living room, with the piano's music guiding them. So he misses that time. He seems irritated, as I said, by the current singer and the piano because they're a reminder of his past, but they're not as good as his memories. This is quite important, the nature of memory. If something reminds you of something in the past, you might prefer the past and it might kind of make you upset with your present. So he feels that both the piano and singer are kind of vain and they're trying to amuse or impress themselves or make money or to show how great they are, rather than because it's spiritual and because it's family and it's got this kind of like communal feeling to it, like that they're all one and they're all taking part in this event. So even though it's the same image, so someone playing the piano, someone singing, people sitting around and listening, it's very different feeling to it, and the feeling kind of upsets him, the fact that it's not the same. He feels stripped of the pressure and expectation, sorry, I'll scroll a bit, of being an adult, and instead feels young and vulnerable like a child, um, because he misses his past. So he says, I weep like a child for the past. So he's sort of transported back into that state of being a young, vulnerable child. He's stripped of his masculinity, his manhood, as he calls it. So everything that makes him a male adult disappears, and he becomes a vulnerable child again when he's thinking about this memory of his mother and his family. It's a very sensitive and emotional poem, and very psychological as well. So if you're interested in psychology and how memory works, how the mind works, if you're interested in sociology and human nature and emotions, all those kinds of things are present in this poem. So the speaker is unnamed. You want to call him the speaker, not the poet. We can assume that it is the poet because it seems very personal, but you never just like say the poet without actually kind of addressing that distinction. So in your essay, you're not just going to say the poet says this, the poet says that. You'd say the speaker, who we assume is the poet, says blah, blah, blah. So you have to deal with the fact that it's never 100% clear that the voice of a poem is the voice of the actual writer, because writers always write in some form of character. So even if this is D.H. Lawrence's real memory of his own childhood, he's kind of turning himself into a character in this poem. He's not like giving us his full self, if you see what I mean. So that's why you always say speaker. So the speaker feels like it's quite a close speaker to the real poet. The tone is very personal and connected to memory. So we assume that the memory is D.H. Lawrence's own. The speaker delves into his own psyche, that means his own kind of mind and his psychology, to retrieve experiences and emotions from the past. So he's digging up these kind of past feelings that he maybe forgot or didn't think about for a long time. And music is a trigger. So music triggers this process of bringing up this memory. I want you to think about a time in your own life where something like this has happened. So, like, you've eaten something, or you've heard something, or you've seen something, and it suddenly just like clicks with you. What it just kind of transports you back to a time and place. I'm trying to think of one for me. There's this time where, when I was like a student at uni, I don't even know why this happened, but I was walking home and it was really late and dark, and there's like no one around, and there's just kind of street lamps and streets. And I went to uni in Bristol, so if you know what Bristol looks like, that's where I was. And suddenly, this kind of piece of tape. It's not very exciting. You're going to think I was mugged or something. I wasn't. Just I just saw a piece of tape on the floor, and yeah, tape is in like a video recorder tape, or like old music playing plastic kind of tapes from like the 90s. One of those just kind of like bundled up and sort of moved across the floor with the wind. And it kind of freaked me out because I realized that we just switched to digital now, and we don't use that kind of stuff anymore. But when I was a kid, I just remember it being everywhere. Like, I remember pulling that tape out of people's videos and getting in trouble for like breaking someone's favorite film. Or I remember when you had like you used to listen to music on these little plastic tape things, and you had to kind of wind it by hand forwards and backwards if you wanted to listen to like a different bit of the song. So it just reminded me of all the times I'd seen that tape, or like touched that kind of tape and interacted with it, and the fact that it was no longer around anymore. And it was really weird that there was this tape there, because it was way after everyone switched to DVDs and Blu-ray and Netflix, and we're way beyond tape nowadays. So yeah, it was a really weird trigger because it was something that used to be around that no longer is, and people don't have anymore. And that was, yeah, just my example of something like this happening. There's loads of other examples like smells or food that triggers quite a lot for me. Certain sounds, I think. Certain kind of feelings as well. Like if you So if you go to like a different country and the atmosphere feels different, that can feel kind of homely or remind you of different holidays you've had. So yeah, I want you to think about this in yourself, because the more you're aware of that feeling of like how you actually engage with the past and nostalgia, the more you'll understand this poem and feel confident to analyze it. And you should really do that with all literature. It's about like exploring yourself and who you are and how you're kind of you work and how you interact with the world, and then how other people do that and whether it's similar or different. So hopefully you feel kind of connected to the poem, you kind of understand the feelings in it. We're going to go more technical now, so we're going to go into the structure, form, and language, and a little bit of context and themes just to finish off. So, structure and form wise, we have a non linear chronology. That means time doesn't move in a line, it jumps around in time between past and present. So, that creates a sense of nostalgia, meaning that feeling of longing for the past. The line length is also irregular, so there's quite a lot of irregularity to this poem. Maybe that's because the feeling of the poem is irregular, or because memory is imperfect and irregular, something like that. So the lines get longer as the stanza goes on, showing perhaps that the speaker is delving deeper and deeper into the memory, and as he delves deeper, more detail appears to him. So if you kind of push, it's a bit like a dream. If you kind of try and remember a dream you've had, you might vaguely remember it. And then if you spend a while thinking about it, you can like properly, bring up what you actually felt and thought, and you remember little details from it. So it's kind of got a sense of building, and it creates a similar feeling to how memory works and how it kind of comes flooding back. We have a semicolon, which you can call a caesura, at the end of the first line, and that's where the first time shift occurs. The semicolon creates a long pause in speaking. Hopefully, you noticed when I spoke it that way at the beginning of the lesson. And this indicates a jolt or a kind of skipping or a time shift. It disrupts the smooth flow or the rhythm of the poem. There are also many commas that kind of give small pauses to the rhythm and the flow. And it sort of forces you as a reader, when you read it aloud, you'll notice you have to take short breaths quite a lot, and it creates kind of breathlessness. So maybe it's because he's quite overwhelmed with emotion from this memory, or because it's coming back to him in kind of fragments and waves of images, which is um, how memory works for a lot of people. It feels kind of fragmented, like rather than one solid scene, like how you'd see in a film. It comes back in like little details, like, oh, I remember this, and then I remember that thing that's connected to this, and so on. So, fragmentation is a good word to talk about with this poem. There's a static image with the singer and the piano, like they're just one thing. And then there's a progression of images when he's talking about his childhood. I've not really gone into that too much here, but think about the contrast between those and how that changes the sort of structure of the poem, like this one single present moment and all this kind of progression of images in the past. Again, it links to this fragmentation. Each line is end stopped. Make sure you're confident using that technique. It means a full stop at the end, basically. It's really easy to figure out, but end stop sounds fancy and it's a technical poem term, so learn that one. It means that each stanza is separate and they're kind of like on their own. And I want you to think more about why did he do it that way? Why doesn't it flow? He uses quatrains, which is 4-line stanzas, and that's quite regular. There's no like irregularity in the stanza length. So I feel like this is kind of like a hymn because he's talking about hymns and singing. It creates the idea of like it being a song or a musical verse. It creates a sort of like the rigid structure of lullabies and childhood songs that are sung to you, and they're quite repetitive and regular. So that's kind of why I feel he uses quatrains, 4-line stanzas. Then we have a rhyme scheme. So we've got rhyming couplets, each 4-line stanza. So each quatrain is split into A, A, B, B. And again, this is your regular sound pattern a little bit soothing and comforting, like a lullaby. Couplets are love poetry usually. So maybe he's sort of expressing his love for his mother or for his family that he misses, and the poem itself is kind of like dealing with the theme of love and connection, that type of thing. There's also an internal rhyme. Actually, forgot to make that bold. So within each line, there might be some rhyming, and it kind of helps you emphasize certain words, but it also creates a bit of a disruption to this regular pattern and rhythm. So you can think about that as well. All of these are really good things to talk about in your essay, and you have to get at least one structure form point in there, as well as your language points. So make sure that you're confident in structure and form, and you can analyze it in detail, as well as language. So the language then, it's emotive language, meaning it's really emotional, and it kind of creates a strong emotion in us, as well as showing how strongly the speaker is affected by what's going on. There's a sense of continuous verbs. These are verbs that end in ing. So woman is singing, child is sitting, pressing. Creates kind of fluidity and movement, like things are not static, they're kind of transitioning and unfolding in action in front of us. Feels a bit like a film or a play that we're watching. There's a semantic field of nostalgia, which we've discussed already, but semantic field is a very high level technique. I always say this in my poetry lessons, so sorry if you've watched quite a lot of them and you just hear me say this all the time, but make sure you know what a semantic field is, you're confident analysing it. I have language devices lessons on Scribbly if you want to watch those, and so on. So nostalgia, memory, and fond memory, like longing to be part of the past. There's a bittersweet tone, which is a nice word, bittersweet. Sort of sad that it's not happening anymore, but then happy that he experienced it, and kind of a contrast between his present and his past there. There's sibilance, which is a repeated S sound, which is kind of soothing, a little bit like a mother looking after a child, a mother who smiles as she sings, kind of, this circling S sound. The mother and the woman, as I was saying, they're contrasted directly, so that he doesn't like this singing woman. She might be a good singer, she might be very beautiful, but she's not his mother, and he's connected more to her as this nurturing and creative presence, whereas the woman in front of him seems like quite a selfish person who's just singing to kind of enjoy herself, or for the sake of having a job, rather than actually creating this feeling, this kind of strong feeling that he had when he was connected to his mother. So she's kind of cold, self-centered, or vain, the woman, whereas the mother is comforting and protective. He, as a child, physically sits kind of at her feet, like under the piano. So, it's a very protective kind of little space that he remembers. This one is kind of like, it's actually more of a structure point than language. I don't know why I chucked it in here. But the rhythm of the line is trochaic, meaning there's a falling meter. So make sure you understand meter and feet and so on when you're doing poetry, and also Shakespeare. It's quite an important thing to get your head around. Basically, it means like, how do the syllables work? Like, which syllables do we stress or not stress? So this line, softly in the dusk, a woman, you can see that so, in, dusk, w, these are all syllables that we stress. So when you split it into two syllables, so a foot, it's always the first part of the foot that's stressed and the second part is unstressed. So that means that it's kind of got a top heavy feeling to it, and we call it a falling rhythm. So it creates this sense that we're like tumbling or falling into something. And I feel like this is a way for him to evoke the feeling of tumbling back into the past, or tumbling back into his memory. It also creates a kind of rocking motion, and it feels again like a lullaby. There's auditory imagery, so sound imagery. When you talk about imagery, make sure you can split it into the five senses and you know how to analyze them separately because it makes it a lot better of a point. The boom of tingling strings, it's onomatopoeia as well, you could say. Just write that one in. Difficult word to spell, took me years to spell that one right, so I'm happy I've done it there. Yeah, so boom, tingling, they feel like they sound like how they are, so it creates that musical quality to the language. And it creates an atmosphere of sound that is contrasted or contradicting. So sometimes it's loud, like boom of tingling strings burst into clamour. That's very loud sounds. Tinkling piano is kind of softer and more pleasant. Sometimes it's enjoyable sound, sometimes it's not so enjoyable. When it's in the present, he's not that happy about the sound. When it's in the past, he remembers it fondly and pleasantly. So there is a contrast with this imagery as well. It's not just all the same type of auditory imagery. It's kind of having two different conflicting effects there. And finally, for language, we've got personification, the tinkling piano, our guide. So the piano turns into a guiding figure, a leading presence. It's also maybe protective or helpful to him as a child, and it takes on a life of its own. So the music comes to life physically in this poem. So hopefully that's really useful for you and you're feeling like you've got more ideas about how to analyze it. As always, this is not like everything you can say, so definitely spend long with the poem, think about, your own interpretations and what you can say about it versus what I've put here. I'm going to finish with just like a few little pieces of context and a few themes. Here we go. So you don't need tons of context usually for GCSE, but a little bit is nice, and I kind of aim for like one small context point per paragraph just to enhance the thing you're analysing. So a few things I like. 1918, know the time period, it's just after the war. He's an English poet, so know about England in 1918, what it was like. It's modernist, which is what I mentioned at the beginning, so that means it's a certain type of literature that is connected to a literary movement, like a certain group of people that wrote modernist stuff. They actually rejected Victorian ideas and they were trying to be modern and new, as the name suggests. They're quite interested in psychology and film and photography and all of these new things that were developing at the time that he wrote this poem. And you can see that in the actual poem as well. You can see like these influences. He was part of the Bloomsbury group, which I love. It's like this group of people in London. There's this road that they all lived on or they all hung out on. And every time I walk down that road, I'm like, one day I'll have a house here and it will be D.H. Lawrence's house or it will be Virginia Woolf's house or something. It's like one of these, everyone has like these silly dreams that probably never happen, but you kind of hope it does. That's like probably my silly dream, I guess. Maybe one day if Scribbly gets big enough. It'd be cool to run Scribbly out of that house. It'd just be amazing. It'd be very respectful to D.H. Lawrence and his group of writers, modernists. But yeah, again, they're interested in psychology, emotion, memory, time, that kind of thing. Yeah, and they live in Bloomsbury, which is a nice area in London. If you're ever in London, do visit it. It's beautiful. Finally, Lawrence was 33 when he wrote this poem, a bit older than me. And yeah, so he's a full adult by this point. He actually died really young, like he died maybe when he was like 50 something. So he's over halfway through his life at this point, although he doesn't actually know that. And he's fully into being an adult man, like a grown-up person. And so it's interesting that he's way past the moment where he was a child, yet he's still longing for this childishness, wanting to go back to being a little baby. You can again think about your own experience. Did you ever have a point where you had this problem with childhood and adulthood? Probably most of you taking these courses are going to be in between. So you'll be teenagers or young adults, kind of like early 20s, And yeah, and you're feeling like you're becoming an adult, but you're not quite not a child, and you're sort of in that transitional period. So, be interesting for you to think about, like, do I push forward and try and be more adult, or do I miss being a kid and just try and hold on to my childhood? Like, what kind of person are you? Because people are different. I've always been like, I think, quite mature and tried to be more adult than my age. So even when I was like 10, I was like pretending I was really big and adult. I think it's because I'm the oldest. Oldest still like that. My sister, who's the youngest, is like the opposite. She's still a kid, even though she's pretty old now. Yeah, so different personalities have different responses. And yeah, how does your own memory work? How do you engage with psychology? What do you think psychology is, and how does it kind of help us understand our perception of reality and the world around us? Do you have any feelings of nostalgia? How do you see time? All of these are really important questions with this poem. The more you connect them to your own experience, the easier you'll find it to analyze. So, as a final thing today, I want you to think about that, and I want you to maybe fill out these themes. How does the poem relate to these ideas? How do you relate to these ideas? And then, what kind of messages can we get out of the poem about these themes? So, it's really important to go into the messages so that you can analyze it on that level in your essays. So, that was a very quick whiz through this poem. Hopefully, it's been useful for you and you feel like you've learnt something. And yeah, hopefully, you enjoyed this little lesson on the piano. And thank you for listening. And I'll see you guys soon in my other poetry lessons.